Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about an individual who had a profound effect upon my life in the field of collecting, in the field of life, the field of understanding, the field of history, the field of ocean liners and ships, and so much more. And his name was Ted Spangenburg. I alluded to him a little bit when I talked about Hollywood and what's going on in Hollywood. And he had been a bit actor who worked in Hollywood in the late 30s into the 1940s. And he was hanging out at Shangri-La quite a bit. But I want to talk about him as a person because he's been gone now for nearly a quarter of a century. And you know, if you look at the history of man and life, after about a quarter of a century, our memories of individuals start to fade, and before long they're forgotten. But I wanted to talk about Ted because he was an individual that was unlike anyone I have ever met before, and most probably unlike anyone I'll ever meet again. Ted was born in Clifton, New Jersey, 100 years ago, in a rather happy home. His father did many different things. One of the things his father was involved in was the early age of radio, and his father worked on that. His mother stayed at home. Ted, at an early age, had a fondness for music and art and ships. And he would tell me that so often, when he was a boy, he would go down to the Hudson and watch the various ships come sailing in. And he was of an age where he saw, the Olympic and the Aquitania and the Majestic and the Berengaria and the Normandy. And he took pictures of lots of them. And he gave me the pictures. And also he had a lot of advertising portraits of ships, which he gave to me as well. He was, in a sense, my father. My real father left early in my life, and my mother had remarried to a vicious drunk, and he would beat me up a lot. And so I used to try to hide. And the thing is that Ted was there, protected me, gave me some dignity, and told me that life is worthwhile. He's really a good man. He ran what was called the Player Piano Headquarters. It was in Boonton, New Jersey. And he repaired pianos. That's what he did in his later years. He had a partner in the business for a while whose name was Carl Thompson. Carl died around 1981. But Ted kept the business going until his own death in 1994. Ted always had cars. He was fascinated with old cars. And, well, they weren't that old when he had them, but he had Packards, and he had, all the Marmon, actually. He had one Marmon, he told me. But he drove out to Hollywood in the late 30s in a Packard. While in California, he purchased a Packard convertible, and he used to drive on the beach, the Malibu beach. And he said what we would all do is is get naked, hop into our cars, drive the cars with our feet, because the controls for the speed were on the steering wheel. You could do the throttle, and that's the way they would drive. That's like kids. It was wild and crazy stuff to do in the late 30s, early 40s. Then he got involved in working in Hollywood. His father had some individuals that they knew, and there was a big strike that was going on at the time, so it kind of affected him, and he went to work at a hotel. He got into this wild affair with the chef there, which was a lady there. And the next thing he knew, he had an affair going on with the lady's daughter. And pretty wild stuff that was going on, I'll tell you. Other things. He said he learned the perfect secret how to hide anything. He used to have a sailor's cap. And if anything nefarious was going on in his room, he would hang it over the doorknob because the keyhole was underneath and no one could see in. Interesting. But during his times in Hollywood, his life was very much like a wild novel for a while. And while he was in Hollywood, he ended up spending time in Shangri-La, which was the series of bungalows in Hollywood, where actors could be themselves. They're gay lovers, they're straight lovers, they're lesbian lovers, whatever it may be. They just lived as they actually were, and that's where they could do it. And Ted shared a bungalow for a while with Robert Benchley. Now, Robert Benchley was at the tail end of his career, and he was a notorious drinker. And Ted used to tell me, he said, the first thing that happened, he'd wake up in the morning and there was Robert Benchley at the kitchen table, bottle of scotch and glass, and an empty glass across the way from him, waiting for Ted to sit down, because breakfast was served. You know, Robert Benchley would die in 1945 from the effects of alcoholism. There were lots of other people there. In fact, Ted mentioned to me how he would go over and spend time with Robert Walker, who was an actor. And Robert Walker was an emotional wreck, he said. Now, Selznick, the producer, had just stolen Walker's wife away. And he said he used to sit there and just hold Robert Walker and hold and let him cry. He said he was an absolute wreck. He said he was such a handsome man, but just an emotional disaster. And eventually he would die from the effects of many things going on. Much to do with his drinking, sadly. That's what led to the demise of lots of actors. Ted, after doing his Hollywood stint, came back east and started working for RCA Victor and worked in their stores and repairing Victor and RCA Victor machines, in which he started working on some of the old wind-ups. People would bring them in, and he learned all about them. He taught me how to work on all the old machines. That's how I learned much of my craft, was from watching Ted. He did that for many years, and he used to bring the latest releases home, and he said his mother, now his real name was Theodore, but he always went by Ted, but he said at home he was Theodore, and he said he would come home and he had in their basement, which was finished, he had his RCA Victor machine, and his mother would say, "Theodore, who is performing tonight? John Charles Thomas?" And he used to give concerts to his mother. Well, I met Ted in 1974. And it was interesting. I had just started collecting. And I was fascinated with the era of vaudeville. And I had found like singers like Henry Burr and Billy Murray and Irving Kaufman and that ilk. 1914, 1925. That era seemed to fascinate me. And I walked into his store in Boonton, New Jersey, because I happened to go to a store that was across the street with a friend of mine. And I heard a piano playing, and I heard the song. And I walked in the front door of this store with all the pianos, and I turned to my friend and said, "I have a record of Henry Burr singing this." And suddenly, this thunderous voice in the back of the building said, "Henry Burr!" And out came Ted. Now, one has to understand that Ted was quite an experience. There he was, with orange socks, green shorts, and a striped shirt on, holding a cigarette with a cigarette holder, and came walking out, strutting out, and introduced himself. Whirled me around, and before long I was walking out the door and had a pile of records in my hand. I didn't know what hit me. Well, the thing was, it was called a infection of Ted Spangenburg, because it turns out that Ted Spangenburg attracted people from all over the world. And every Saturday we would all go to his store, and there would be people from everywhere, all coming to see this rather interesting and colorful character. It's also interesting that most of us really had nothing in common in many respects, but Ted was the glue that held this entire group together. And there were old people, there were young people, there were all, you name it, right across the spectrum there were people. Many of the friends who I treasure today, I met at Ted's store. He was like a Pied Piper, fun, taught me so much about life. It taught me you have to keep laughing about stuff and enjoying your life, because if you let things get a hold of you, you can lose everything. And so Ted lived his life, and in the later years of his life he got kind of ill, and he was always there for me. And I tried to be there for him toward the end of his life. I was there with him at the hospital as he slowly sank into death. I miss him. I think of him a lot. He gave an awful lot to an awful lot of people. But I have to tell you, his influence on a kid, me, changed my life forever and gave me purpose in life. And you know something? Having your dignity, having your understanding, and understanding that everything that you are is not bad, and teaching people that is perhaps one of the greatest gifts that one can give. And so to this day, I try to carry on what Ted taught me. I meet people, I try to be really great and nice to them and share with them and teach them things. Let them know life is for living, and things aren't really as bad as we think they are. So I wanted to say this a little bit about Ted. I know I've left lots of things out. I could probably talk for hours about him, but I don't want to bore the hell out of so many people. But I wanted to give this little tribute to my dear friend, Ted. And to this very day, I miss him. I always will.